All right. Welcome to Reflect, Recalibrate. Woohoo! We are your lovely lady artivist hosts, Danny Snyder and the lovely Janet E. Dandridge. Woohoo! Snap, snap,
Hello,
snap.
hello, hello.
All right. So yeah, thank you guys for coming. Thank you for watching. If you're watching later, we are live today for part 2 of the Design Advocacy Collection. Ooh. Today we are going to chat with Greg Bunbury, a Black British graphic designer, diversity and inclusion consultant, lecturer, and public speaker of Caribbean heritage. And yeah, I'm pumped. Are you pumped, Janet?
I am definitely pumped. I'm just making sure that all the tech is working correctly.
Don't stress, don't stress. It's
Like
working.
I'm just concerned about that. And so we're getting this going, man.
Well, this is why we do call times, and we already had a call time actually with Greg, so we know he's back behind the curtains waiting for us to bring him on. And we've already been having great conversations. I'm so excited. So yes, welcome, Greg. Let's get it going.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, thank you.
Hello.
How's everyone?
Janet looks a little stressed. I'm intellectually pumped, and I haven't even had caffeine yet today, so that's saying something. How are you feeling?
I'm good. I'm good. It feels like the tech is working. It feels like we're all good over the main hurdle.
Okay. Yes. Woo.
Yeah,
We're
the
All
all
right.
good.
live is new for us. It's new, but it's exciting because for me as the editor, I don't have to edit anymore. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
as somebody who has had a podcast, the editing is crazy. Is
Yeah.
absolutely bonkers. Just, spending 3 days looking at your own face and trying to match and sync audio. Oh, this is
Yeah.
better. This is way better.
Way better. Way better. Awesome. Well, we have so many questions for you. And sometimes we even do an icebreaker question. And Janet was like, nope, we got to get right into it. So we're going to jump right into the title of our collection, which is Design Advocacy. Can you
Mhm.
define for us, in your terms, what is design advocacy?
So, in terms of design advocacy, there are many definitions. The term has been used for quite a long while in loads of different contexts. Traditionally, design advocacy is promoting the value of design within an organization or a sort of a process. As I use it, design advocacy is employing the methodology of design to influence the service of a cause or a concern. So it takes design as really the point of transformation rather than the output of design. So by building our process around a cause or an idea and building that into how we deliver design or how we think about design or how we discuss design, um, it's really about persuasion and influence, which is really what advocacy is. Advocacy tends to work within the system, and it's usually about persuasion or influence within that system. So an example of that might be working on an ad campaign that's targeted at Southeast Asians, and then advocating that a Southeast Asian photographer should be taking the photos. Or it might be looking at a communication that's aimed at a neurodiverse audience and advocating that accessibility should be built into the copy or the design so that it's legible for people of varying abilities. So it's really about building this idea of influence and persuasion within the system. Activism tends to be outside the system. So advocacy is within, activism is without. Now, uh, these are just my definitions. So these definitions may land different for everyone else. And I'm not saying that my definitions are set in stone. You're free to make or create your definitions as it serves your work. For me, activism is more about direct action. So activism is more about policy, legislation, and the law. True activism, in terms of my experience, is actions that attempt to influence or change policy, legislation, or the law. Advocacy is almost, I guess, a softer form of that, but because it's usually within the system, whereas activism depending on the type of activism we're talking about. So we have activism that is perhaps more conservative, and we have activism which is perhaps more disruptive. Now, it's not to say that there's a hierarchy of activism or advocacy, like one is better than the other. It really depends on where the individual is and the sort of change that individual wants to create in the space that they're around. So it's really a sense of understanding the space that you're in and understanding which approach will benefit the change that you want to create. The problem is when we are doing one, but we think we're doing the other. And that's usually where we see a lot of dissonance, especially with younger creatives, especially with designers that I teach. And people want to get into this space because they want to do work that is meaningful and purposeful and work that they feel really strongly about. And that usually takes the form of very impactful, very visual, very creative sort of facets of communication. But the thing is, those sorts of approaches don't always serve activism, because activism, so much of activism is just about organizing. So much of activism is just about creating spaces. It's another way to sort of conceptualize it. It's the difference between direct marketing and brand marketing. So brand marketing is Nike, just do it. So brand marketing is the long tail. It's the idea that Nike aren't trying to get you to do anything right now, but at some point in the future, Nike is betting that you're going to buy some running shoes. And when that happens, they hope that you think of Nike. That's brand advertising. Direct advertising is 10% off, buy now, one-click shopping, buy today and get 50% off. It's about more direct action. A lot of the challenges that I see with younger designers is that they get into the sort of activism space wanting to do brand marketing. They want to do these really big, sexy campaigns and posters and logos, but that's not always what's needed in terms of grassroots activism. What's needed in grassroots activism typically is organizing, it's communication. The protest is tomorrow at 12 p.m. We need people to sign this petition. We need people to sign this form. We need to raise these signatures. We need to raise this money. And it's not always about sort of big, sexy communications. So to kind of surmise the original question, because I'm just going to go on forever. But yeah, for me, advocacy is very much within the system, and it's very much around persuasion and influence, whereas activism is more about direct action and typically takes place outside of the system.
I see the thumbs up from Janet. Does that mean we're working? Are we live again? Is it coming up on YouTube? Is it official?
Yes, it's working. It's just YouTube was just like, let me just give you some gremlins real quick so that it doesn't work.
It is Halloween. Yeah, it is Halloween. So that's
so
fair.
there you go.
Yeah, we started a podcast interview, y'all, and then we were like, I don't think no one can watch us. So yeah, today we're speaking with Greg Bunbury, who's here with us today. Thank you for coming, Greg. I'm going to go ahead and just say real quick who you are again, but I would love for you to elaborate more on all the things that you do. You do so much. But yes, on your website, you describe yourself as a Black British graphic designer, diversity and inclusion consultant, lecturer, and public speaker of Caribbean heritage. I know you like us, you love to do lots of things. If you want to elaborate a little bit more on all.
Yeah, of course. So I guess the main thing is, I think how people view me, or how they tend to view me, is as a graphic designer, and sometimes as an artist. And it sounds like I do a lot of different things, but really they're all the same thing. They're just on a different section of the line, if that makes sense. So all of the work, or everything I do, is really about this one sort of central idea, that how we make things is as important as what we make. Now, when I was learning to design at school and at college, at university, I was taught that design was the thing you made. It's the website, it's the logo, it's the poster, it's the item of clothing, it's the graphic on the t-shirt. And that's how I saw design. I just saw it as the thing that you did that made something. And what I noticed is, after kind of years and years and years and years and years of doing it, one of the things that I noticed was that for a kind of a discipline that was very output orientated. There was a lot of process. There was a lot of discussions. There was a lot of conversations. There was a lot of chat. And as I became kind of more senior at my role, I kind of figured out that I was kind of doing more talking than designing. And I was like, well, this is interesting. And what that kind of led me to was the transformation was really in those conversations. I can remember being on calls with clients for 2, 3 hours and them talking about everything. And it was nothing to do with design. It was their hopes and their dreams and what they want to do with their business and how they see the world, and just trying to get somebody to understand their vision. And I started to realize that that process was really the moment of transformation. And it was almost like the design was just a souvenir of that process. So the thing I produced at the end was like a souvenir of this transformative experience. And based on some of the kind of more negative experiences I had as a younger designer, being in tremendously marginalized spaces, I realized that if you could change the methodology of how you worked, if you could change the process, if you designed the process itself, it could produce a different result. And then I was like, okay, so what would happen if, we had somebody neurodiverse working on this brief? How would that change things? Or what if we use a different photographer that, rather than the one that was always used, or somebody from a marginalized group? How does that affect the output? And that's really the central thesis to everything I do, because it's all about that point of transformation. Design is just one methodology of transformation. The consultancy work is almost like, if you imagine a straight line, consultancy and the strategic part is on one side. And when people tend to think about graphic communication design, it usually is kind of nearer the other end. So in the life cycle of a project, an organization will say, hey, we've got a challenge. We need to figure this out. There'll be some meetings. There'll be a budget. There'll be a team put together. And it'll go on and on and on. And eventually someone will say, okay, we better call a designer. And that's usually near the end of the process. So what that means is there's less scope for transformation. Because if my work is just based on delivering an output, if they go, hey, we need you to design this poster, and we need it by next Wednesday, there isn't always scope for me to say, hey, is this language correct for the group that we're trying to engage with? Is there something that we should be sort of mindful of? So it's really about trying to elevate not just my position in that process, but the value of what I do in that process, and make it value orientated away from labor. Okay, that's a really key point, is that we want to move design and design thinking away from labor. We want to move away from what I call handwork to what I call headwork, because in the headwork, there's value. In the headwork, that's where the transformation is. That's where the conversations are. That's where the discussion is. And that's where there's room for change. And depending on what kind of change you want to see in the world, for me, it was always about, how do we make these spaces more equitable? How does design as a tool create more equity? How does it create more diversity? How does it create more inclusion? Because we can design spaces, we can design conversations, we can design discussions, we can design workshops. It's not just about the graphics on the page. By using this methodology, and there's several methodologies within design, it might be something like the double diamond or design thinking, but all of these processes are about ideas, iteration, and analysis and learning. And if we can approach that sort of methodology to how we see all kinds of problems, then design becomes elevated. It becomes elevated beyond the output. So, the irony is that even though I'm known for a lot of my poster work and a lot of the billboard work, it's really the conversations and the discussions that are the most important part. It's really my writing, and it's really the books I've read and the discussions around issues like social issues around race or gender or class. Those are the things that give my work value, rather than my skill as a designer. I'm skilled as a designer, that's all good, but that is limited in terms of its scope, because that just comes down to labor. And if all we're doing is trading our labor, then we're not trading based on value. Sorry, that was a super long-winded response to that.
No,
I do that a lot.
I think that's great. And also, Like I was about to say, like, I sometimes worry that we define ourselves so much by what we do, and that's not it completely. Like, and I know that, Jana, if you want to ask a question, I know something that you and I were also curious about was thinking about like how you build your wealth, but not just like financially, and we're talking about labor, but in terms of like spirituality, for example, or if maybe Janet, you want to elaborate a little bit more on that question.
Yes, we were thinking about this in part one, and you sort of just shared with us what we were thinking, shared back with us what we were thinking about design and design advocacy and what does that involve. You were just saying you can design all of these things, but where is it equitable? And then when we talk about being equitable, we started to think about how do you thrive within this space? How do you survive within this space? More so thrive. And thinking about that, you think about finances and how you pay bills, something that's basic as, how are we going to pay for food while we are doing this work? You refer to the work, I think, in some research that I've done, this design entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship. And oftentimes, when we provide that label, when describing an entrepreneurial quest, people don't think that that involves getting any type of monetary return. So I'm wondering about, and we actually are wondering, how do you balance that? How do you create a thriving livelihood when the work that you're doing is about the effect, right? The action that can happen based on the work that you put out into the world dealing with social challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, so the first thing is that we have to understand what wealth creation is. So if we're just speaking about just finances, wealth creation in terms of creative is based on largely a combination of one of three things. Okay. Volume, scope, and value. So that means you either produce something at such a volume, like let's say you you design postcards. That means in order to sell enough postcards to pay your rent, you have to shift an enormous amount of postcards. So Amazon as a business works on volume. There's scope. So let's say you're an architectural firm and you get a bid to redesign a city center. You only really need to do one or maybe two of those every like 3 to 5 years. If it has enough scope, if it's huge enough, if you're talking about projects that are tens of millions of dollars. And then there's value. So you're solving problems that are really, really, really valuable to companies with deep pockets. That's how wealth creation happens in terms of creative. Now, in terms of the activism and advocacy space, that's not really possible for a large, it's not impossible, but it's not really possible. Because if you're talking about a community organization, they don't have deep pockets. They don't have that sort of budget. They don't have the finances to pay a creative what they're worth. So if you're like, even as a junior creative, let's say as a junior creative, you get paid like let's say £100 a day, or in US, that's like what, 125, 150, something like that. A lot of community run organizations are based on volunteers. They're based on collaborators. They're based on the community coming together to try and affect cause around some issue. And there's no way they can pay even a junior designer for 3 weeks of work, even at that like junior rate. So there's an issue here. This space is very dynamic, and it really comes down to what the individual wants to set out for themselves. So like one way of putting it would be, if I went to a creative and said, right, you can have your dream job where you get to affect change on a massive scale for a really purpose-led organization or cause that you're really passionate about, and your work will have meaning and purpose and all of that. But the flip side is you're going to make 20% of what you make right now. Like, who would take that gig if it meant that you had to move to a smaller town, You had to really reduce your lifestyle. You really had to think about, you couldn't, enjoy going out or just buying stuff or frivolous spending. And it's really difficult because all of the people that I've put that question to are just absolutely not. Just absolutely not. So now we have to navigate a space where we want our work to have meaning, we want it to have purpose, but in the spaces where it has the most meaning and the most purpose, those are the spaces where we can't necessarily thrive, right? So we have to make a choice and we have to decide. Now, some people will go the funding route, and those are usually self-initiated artists. Some studios are a bit like that. There are organizations that do make money from advocacy work. They tend to be in the comms side of things, in the PR and comms stuff. So that's ESG, environmental, social governance. And they work with giant multinational corporations and brands. But it's very sort of removed from creative. So in terms of how you do that, and this is just one way, and this is just my way, it might not necessarily be everybody's cup of tea, as it were. My commercial work allows me to be in advocacy and activist spaces. So the commercial work I do as a graphic communication designer, I work with theaters and publishers, and I've designed, theater campaigns and book covers and album covers and all of these things. The commercial work, all of those clients are still in the, I would say, purpose-driven space. So there's still organizations that align with my purpose. There's still organizations, they might not be as directly involved. They're not necessarily activist-led projects, but they're organizations that are either focused on diversity and inclusion or have some angle. They're either trying to reach marginalized audiences or trying to bring in diversity in some form or fashion. That commercial work allows me to do other work that I couldn't afford to do just on its own. So, as an example, I worked on a project for a community group. And the project lasted for about 9 months. And it was like a tremendous amount. It was meetings, it was development, it was creative, it was going back and forth for a period of about 9 months. And on that project, I made as much as I typically would make in a single day as a commercial designer. Now, if I had to live on those sorts of community projects, it'd just be impossible. So my commercial work allows me to be in those spaces. And it also allows me to be generous with my time. So one of the things about being a creative is, I always think of it as somewhere between being a priest and a therapist. So much of it is talking. So much of it is trying to help people or trying to help people with their vision or navigate spaces, especially if you're a creative working in a marginalized space and other marginalized designers, usually students or junior designers, are looking to you for some sort of pathway. And because of my commercial work, I can give some of my time. I can hop on calls, or I can give advice, or I can look at like people's portfolios and go, okay, here's what you want to do. This is the way you should, I don't know, maybe format this or think about your direction. So the work that I do frees up my time and frees up my energy into other areas that just wouldn't be possible. Now, there is a line because everybody has bills to pay and we're all under this system. We're all still working under this system, and there's no option to sort of check out of that, right? So that's the reality. So there is a line where there'll be times when I can't donate my time, or there'll be projects that I just can't do, or I can't afford to do, because it will just take too much energy or it'll take too much room. And it's this constant navigation. It's this constant shifting relationship between, here's the work that I think is impactful and meaningful. It's all impactful and meaningful, just in a very different way. Some work is more direct and some work perhaps not. And it's really just trying to balance the two and make sure that you know, I am sort of fulfilling my uh, kind of obligations financially, but in a way that still kind of furthers my mission. Now, that's not necessarily a pathway that would work for absolutely everybody. But the problem is when I speak to younger creatives who just want to work in advocacy or activism spaces, even though those projects are meaningful and they're passionate, they're hard. They're tough projects to do because a lot of times, especially with community organizations, they're not experienced like marketing agencies are. So they're not as uh, sort of comfortable or knowledgeable about the overall process. So there's a lot more hand holding. There's a lot more development. There's a lot more conversations, and that can be really, really taxing. And especially if the project that you're working on is around sensitive or triggering subject matter, and you're having to take this on. So if it's around something like an anti-racism campaign or something I've worked on with regards to deaths in police custody, and these are really like hardcore subjects, and it's really difficult to take all of that on. So all of that is to say that even though this work is meaningful and it's passionate, it's also hard. So I guess my advice to anybody who is sort of trying to navigate that space is to just kind of really consider what you need to get out of it and really consider what it would take to make that possible. So what would it take for you to be able to work on your dream project or your dream client or the thing that means the most to you? And what are you willing to sacrifice for that? How much are you willing to give up? And there's always going to be a line, but that's kind of, I guess, a really fertile place, if anything. A lot of my work comes from the tension in that relationship between these very sort of commercial projects and these projects that are perhaps more kind of purpose orientated. In that space, in that kind of like that little bit of tension there, that's where I find like I get so much inspiration. I get so much like really strong work from that, because you're always like, how far can I push this? If it's a commercial project, how far can I push it to the left? Like, how much of me can I get in there? How much disruption can I bring to it? And if it's a project that's perhaps more on the sort of community side, you're just trying to figure out a way to do it that serves the project, but you also have to be mindful of your own energy, your own time, your own space. And yeah, it's a very interesting spot to be in.
Yeah, you definitely have to take care of yourself. Like you said, the mental work and the spiritual work that it takes to do the grassroots work, and to do that not only, for the organization that needs it, but to ensure that you are fulfilling what it is that you desire to be an advocate for, and that you are able to move within the space feeling comfortable enough with everything else that you have to maintain, in your life while doing this necessary work. Because I just had a conversation with someone about how I always receive a text from one of the grassroots organizers that I work with, and everything is always urgent. And this person was just like, well, that's by design, right? Socially, everything is urgent because there's always someone who is having a problem because of oppression. And I was like, wow, yeah, exactly. And this is why it's urgent. However, we have to take care of ourselves, right? We have to manage, how we provide our energy and how we hold our energy. We have to take walks. We have to listen to music. We have to meditate. We have to say, hey, no, like you said, the line. I'm curious to follow up on that. How do you evaluate the companies that you work with to know that, hey, yeah, I think I can actually push this, far left, right, within this sort of space? How do you evaluate the spaces that you work within when it comes to that commercial side?
Yeah, so obviously you do your research, you do your due diligence, you look at the About Us page on the website and take stock of the types of faces that you're seeing. You read up about companies, you ask other people's experiences of that. These networks are very connected. And a lot of my work comes from referrals, which is really good because it's kind of a process of vetting in itself. But ultimately, you can never really know. And this is a really important point for creatives in this space. Uh, when things are going well, then everybody's great with DEI. Everybody's great with diversity and inclusion. It's really who the organization is when something doesn't go right. That's when you really see kind of how they are, how they respond. And I've had shocking experiences with organizations that have positioned themselves in ethical and equitable spaces. And then when something's gone wrong, like suddenly all of these tropes pop out of nowhere, and suddenly somebody's like telling you that you're being uppity, and you're like, oh wow, huh, that didn't take long. So it's this constant evaluation, and you can never be entirely sure because we're all working with bias, and sometimes that bias is unconscious, and sometimes people bring stuff to the table that they're not even aware they're bringing to the table. And it can be very, very, very challenging, especially for a marginalized creative, because you're always looking for it. You're always like, if you've experienced it once, if you've been in an office and you've overheard somebody telling a racist joke, every office you'll go into, you're going to be like, hold on a minute, is this like that one time? And you're always on your guard. And that sort of thing that you carry with you, that can be stressful, and that can be draining, and that can be exhausting. And it's this, I guess it's a kind of pressure. It's just this thing that's kind of always running in the background, where you're always just kind of just watching how people move. But sort of to sort of add to that as well, it also means that I have to watch myself, and I have to be mindful of how I respond and how I react in spaces. And I tend to do a lot of listening. I tend to do a lot of listening, especially in conversations, because you know, in terms of how you are as a creative, you are sometimes a facilitator. And that facilitation means really understanding where somebody's coming from. So sometimes it's just letting people talk. And the more they talk, the more you get a sense of where they're coming from, and they'll reveal stuff about their organizations. And sometimes you can just be direct and you can just ask, hey, what happened with that project? Why didn't that work out? How come you don't have any other designers of color? What's that about?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you can get, like, it kind of depends on how you want to do it. I've done that. I've literally done that. And, you get interesting responses. And those responses may inform how you want to move. Is this somebody that, because we're really talking about relationships. Like, this is a relationship business. And so often when people are talking about my work, they look at the posters and the typography and the typefaces and all of these things that I've made, which are all great, but it's really just a business of relationships. And in those spaces, you have to almost treat it like a relationship. Like, you're almost like you're on a date and you're trying to figure out, hey, is this person, are you cool? Like, and it's always that sense. Um, so yeah, well, not to say that you never fully know, but you're always kind of constantly evaluating.
Well, what do you do in those moments that when you're evaluating and then you find something that is problematic? Do you stay with that corporation? Do you say, hey, you know what? I'm going to shift away from this place and look for other spaces to work with? Because I know it's a challenge, right, to find work in the first place for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And then that decision has to be made. I hear this racist joke.
Mm-hmm.
I have a conversation, and then this person gives this type of response. It
Mm-hmm.
reiterates the problem that's in this corporation. Do you then leave and let go of that commercial money that's funding the advocacy and activism work?
This is $1 million question. I had the same question posed to me by a student who was like, look, I need to pay rent. and I can't afford to turn down work. And I'm like, that's the worst position you can be in as a creative. If you cannot say no, that's the worst. And I've been there, and I've been there. And the minute you can't, you literally cannot walk away from it. You cannot, like, the time that actually happened to me was I was in my sort of mid-20s. And when that happens, I wasn't even really on like a proper contract. Like I was just on this like temporary contract thing. So I didn't really have any sort of backing, didn't have a leg to stand on. And I was finishing, my contract was finishing like that week. And then when I had that experience, when I heard that, I didn't know, this is before DEI. This is before those things were on the radar. And I didn't think I could go to HR because I really wanted to work for this company. I couldn't afford not to work for this company. So now the whole, well, I guess objective since then is to not be in that position. So how do you not be in that position? You have to do as much homework upfront as possible. And it's really hard. It's really hard because ultimately, if you say no to too many jobs, then the rent doesn't get paid, right? And that's a really, really tough gig. What I can say though is I went through a period where I only said yes. I only said yes. And I am still carrying some of that to this day. The dissonance of letting things slide. Oh my God. Look, listen, people touching your hair, like
Mm.
making jokes about your genitalia, like, oh my God. Can
Oh,
you rap?
wow.
Can you dance? You do enough of that. You do enough of that, and that will, like, even though you're sure you're paying rent and you're buying food, but it will put you in a dark place. And I ended up in a really dark place with that stuff, for sure. I had so much unresolved anger, and I didn't even know it was unresolved anger until it started manifesting in ways. And suddenly I'm doing mixed martial arts. I'm like getting into bar fights, and I'm not saying it's all because of that, but I do think that stuff played a part. Where letting all of these things slide gets to the point where you like, if I have to let one more thing slide, if I have to let, and you're in that place, and now suddenly, like, you're perhaps moving a little more confrontational, or you're a little more aggressive in your dealings, or you're a little more closed in your view. And so it took me a long time to have to try and figure that out. So even though, like, saying yes to all of those jobs and being in those positions, it paid the rent and allowed me to survive. I don't know if I was doing it all again. I don't know if I would make that choice again. So the goal is to just really not be in that position if you can avoid it. So it's really trying to do as much research as you can with organizations. It's really trying to flip the interview. So a lot of the things I do, a lot of uh, sort of mentoring and coaching around this topic with younger creatives. And it's really about changing the dynamic of the interview, where you're interviewing the interviewer, because we're taught that we have to go in and show our work and smile and, like, please hire me, look how great I am. And it should be the other way around. You should be asking questions like, where have you succeeded? Where have you failed? This is asking the organization, why don't you have more diversity? And just really trying to get a sense of what you're getting into before you get into it. And I know it's not perhaps the perfect answer if you're a struggling creative and you're just looking for opportunities. It's probably not what you want to hear. And in those options, if you don't have a choice, then you don't have a choice. Then I guess you have to tough it out. But just be mindful of the cost that you're paying with that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Just taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
Taking care of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's tough. It's tough. It's a really difficult, especially in, so depending on what sort of sphere of creative that you're working in, um, with the rise of automation and AI, it's going to get a lot worse. It's going to get a much harder, in terms of depending on what area of creative that you're in. But I think it's going to impact pretty much every level. So, there's two goals. Number one is to try and elevate everything that we do as creatives above labor. So that's the main thing. So it's really looking at what value do I create rather than what thing do I create. And another way of really sort of building this, I don't want to call it a wall because that feels defensive, but if you can put your flag in the ground around the kind of person you are, the sort of creative you are, what your values are, you will attract more opportunities that are in line with that than if you're creative just knocking on doors. I see a lot of creatives who are just trying to shop to every single agency. Don't do that. Build something that shows who you are. And if they come to you, then you know they're in alignment. And that's so important. So where does that come from? Self-initiated projects. So when we're talking about things like rest, I think there's active rest and there's passive rest. What I did earlier was passive rest. I didn't do anything. But active rest, when you're a creative in sort of client services spaces, so if you're a web developer or an illustrator or a print designer or a poster designer or a branding designer, you're in service of someone. Okay, so you're in service to a client or an employer or an organization. Even if you're in advocacy or activism spaces, you're in service to a nonprofit, you're in service to a charity, you're in service to a community group. That can be incredibly draining. I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. It's just a lot of work and it can be very intense and it can be very intensive. Self-initiated work is your chance to be your own author of your work. So, artists will do this all the time, but I would say that in terms of that distinction, art tends to be about the artist, design is about users. So design is about utility. How do people use my work? What do they use it for? What do they get from it? I'm not saying it has to be one or the other. Naturally, those lines cross all the time. There's a lot of crossover between the two. So it's not like you have to be in the artist camp or you have to be in the design camp. But I think as an overall view of a discipline, art tends to be about the artist, design tends to be about users. So if you're a designer or a creative on that side, and kind of the same if you're an artist as well, self-initiate a project. That will give you the opportunity to be your own author, to be your own client, to create your own space. But not only that, it telegraphs your values. It puts your values into the world. And it's amazing how well that works in terms of bringing organizations that are way more in alignment with your worldview. And you're going to have a lot less issues with clients in that space. Since my work pivoted into those spaces, so purpose-led, purpose-driven organizations, I've had almost zero problems, touch wood. I'm just going to touch my desk. Zero problems compared to when I worked for record labels. I worked for record labels and film companies for 10 years. I was head of creative for a marketing agency, and that was B2B and comms and IT and tech. Before that, I worked at a fashion company, and before that, I worked in exhibition design. The space that I'm in now, I have so few problems in terms of the people that I work with, my collaborators, the people that I connect with, the people that I am connected with, the people that I help, my networks. They're so much more rewarding and equitable and ethical in their dealings. But that's because my work was basically this massive flag in the ground that said, I stand for this. And other people saw it and went, oh, okay, we stand for that too. We'll contact this guy. Maybe he can help us. So self-initiating work is also a good way to circumvent that idea of, how do I screen potential collaborators? How do I screen potential employers? How do I screen potential clients? It's about building the thing. Oh my God, am I doing Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come. That sort of thing. Sorry, internet. I know that's super
It
cheesy.
works.
Yeah, I'm showing my age as well.
I wish you were my professor because I'm not gonna lie. I remember being in a private music class and my professor was literally falling asleep while I was performing for him and was constantly
Wow.
needing smoke breaks and was constantly like on his phone stressing about the next audition, the next gig he was gonna have. And this is someone who came from Juilliard, who I thought like,
Wow.
I was like, if you haven't figured this out, there's what is
Yikes.
there for me? Like, what am I like? And it, I actually was a music major, and that to me was the deciding point. Like, I can't have that lifestyle. But I feel
Mm,
like when I switched, of course, over to theater, I feel like even in theater, I still had some professors who instilled this fear in me that you have to say yes to everything. You have to say yes to everything. And it messed up my 20s. And
yeah,
I had to pay for it in a lot of therapy. So I
yeah,
just wish I'd had you as my professor because it's very inspiring what you're saying. And I really, I'm resonating a lot with many things you're saying. And obviously my experiences are very, very different. But even when you mentioned the film industry, little triggers for me were coming up like, yeah, no, it's I've honestly, I'm at a point where I don't even know if I can go back to the film industry with the amount of feminism
sure.
issues that I had to deal with. But yeah, I would love to, I know we're tight on time, but I would love to talk a little bit about being a professor and balancing all of that too, teaching into everything that you do.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a professor, so I must make that
My
distinction
bad.
abundantly clear. I'm a sessional lecturer, so what that means is
Oh,
basically I'm
okay.
a part-time lecturer.
All right, all right.
So I don't have professor status. And I think the whole thing with teaching, and I don't think it's entirely dissimilar from music. I think there's a lot of crossover in terms of trying to find spaces to do that thing that you're passionate and how do I make it work in a way that is fulfilling and but also, it keeps a roof over my head. And that's really, really tough. And it's the same for, I often talk about being a graphic designer or being an artist is like, you're basically trying to be like a Hollywood actor. Like it has that same energy where you're just kind of out there, just banging on doors, just trying to kind of get a break. So I think there's a lot of comparable experiences in that. But in terms of teaching, so how I came to lecturing was I was doing a lot of guest talks. So I've delivered guest talks at many universities up and down the UK. And when I started doing that, basically my view on it is this is everything that I wish I'd heard when I went to university. So this is everything that I needed back then in terms of purposeful work, in terms of how to develop as a not just as a creative, but as a thinker, as like how does design intersect with the world? And so my whole sort of entry into that teaching space was here's everything that I wish somebody had said to me. Um, but with that, also this idea of the potential of creativity and the potential of the creative industries as this methodology for transformation, as opposed to a methodology for output. Because I'd done that for years and years and years, and it got me nowhere, absolutely nowhere. Because all you're doing when you're working in that sort of space, you're just trading labor for time and it's not value based. So I came into the space really thinking about that. But what I learned quickly was that the teaching and the consultancy work were just kind of at the opposite ends of the same spectrum, or at least they are in my brain, because a lot of the organizations. So when I do sort of DEI consulting, it might be that an organization has a campaign that they're running. Let's say they have a campaign running next month, and they're not sure, they're aiming it at a diverse audience, but they're not sure if they've gotten everything quote unquote right. Is there anything we should be worried about? Because, they don't have a diverse team. So they'll call somebody like me and I'll look over the campaign or I'll look over the proposal and I'll go, oh, you might need to change this language. You might need to think about this stuff. So a lot of what I do as a consultant in that space is really looking at bias. And as a lecturer or a tutor, I'm in a space where that bias is almost formed, if that makes sense. So you kind of get to see how that bias evolves because all of those students will go on to start companies and they'll start businesses and they'll start agencies of their own and they'll become marketing directors and they'll become creative directors. and they'll develop a campaign, and then they'll go, oh, I'm not sure if this is particularly inclusive, and then they'll call someone like me. So it's almost like I'm at sort of opposite ends of the same spectrum, where, you know, I have an opportunity to really bring this idea of creative transformation into more receptive minds. Because, you know, one of the things about the consultancy work is when you're talking to somebody who's, I don't know, a CFO or an MD or creative director, you know, there'll be some give, but, you know, they're not going to like, ah, you're absolutely right, we're going to rip everything up and start over. So, you know, you might have some influence, but I find that there's usually a point where, you know, the conversation doesn't go any further. But when I'm working with students, there's a lot more potential there, because there's a lot more conversation, there's a lot more discussion, and you can really see them try to sort of figure it out as a creative. So the teaching kind of works really well with the consultancy and the commercial design stuff, because it's almost like you get a chance to shape how they will come into the workplace, how they will I don't want to say shape the future, because it sounds maybe a bit cliched, but it kind of is that. And, you know, I'm not trying to like radicalize students. I'm not trying to make students political. I'm not trying to bring identity politics or make students uh, make all their work about identity politics. What all I'm saying is that you have the ability to create transformation in whichever space you choose to do it. You can do it for Nike and Balenciaga and Samsung, or you can do it for your best friend's band, or the organization that, I don't know, your parents' tennis club, or the church down the road that does a food bank every Wednesday. Like, you get to choose who you do that transformation for. It doesn't have to be for brands. It doesn't have to be organizations. And if you do go down that route, just be mindful that, you know, your work will be output orientated. So there's a high turnaround in agencies, there's a high turnaround in creative agencies and design agencies. But your work can effectively change the world. And I know that sounds really trite and really cliched, but it does. And I've seen the transformation, and it's
Yeah,
amazing how
yeah,
far those conversations and those discussions reach.
yeah, yeah. As you're talking about working with students and being a lecturer, we had a moment where we were discussing working within university and thinking about currently what's going on in universities in the United States. I'm wondering if you can share what's happening in universities in the UK, or specifically where you are, right?
Mhm.
In terms of how they are managing the conversation about war, and in particular, Gaza, and
Mhm.
within the United States, how professors and others who work within the universities are being shut down. They're being told not to talk about this. And if you say anything pertaining to this Gaza war, if you're saying anything that supports Palestinian people, you are being anti-Semitic. So I'm curious, what is going on over there where you
Yeah,
are
yeah.
in terms of
Uh,
this?
of course. So I'll preface this by saying that all these views are my own and not the views of any university or institution that I'm employed by. Um, that being said, each university is different. Each university has its own culture and its own sort of approach in dealing with it. Some universities have been incredibly supportive of student protest and advocacy in this space. Some universities have found it harder. The universities that I'm aligned with, I can say, fortunately, have handled it quite well in terms of creating spaces for students to really lean into their advocacy. In terms of the topics in the classroom, so far there's been a lot of support in terms of dealing with and talking around difficult issues. Um, had a recent project last year where some students were able to bring in some of their views around war and conflict into some of their project work, which was really great and was well supported. Um, but ultimately, I think when we think about sort of university spaces, one of the biggest challenges is that, first of all, we have to agree what university is for. And this is a really important point of what is it for? Because in terms of how students see it, a lot of students may see it as an investment. This is just what you do to graduate and get a better job. And they're not looking at it necessarily as a space where their opinions, views, and perspectives will be enriched, or this is a space for them to, I don't know, a safe space to discuss and pull apart and challenge those views and debate. A lot of students are very pragmatic, and that's fair enough because we all live under this system and universities are damn expensive. So I do understand this idea that it's an investment, and that's some students may be just looking at this in terms of what do I have to do to get the best possible grade to get the best possible job. So I think the first thing is that we all have to agree of what university is for, and that may change based on each university and based on each course. Some courses are going to be more open and more perhaps liberal. Courses in arts and on the creative side tend to be more in that space. But it's dynamic and it's ever evolving. And I guess my role in this is to really get students to lean into that advocacy and to bring that into their work. Because my argument is that's the thing that's going to make their work stand out. That's the thing that's going to make their work impactful. That's the thing that's going to make their work memorable because it's about them. And this is that thing of elevating their work above labor into something where it becomes more, not just about their perspective, but how they see the world and how they can channel that into whether that be communication design or interaction design or service design. So, there have been a lot of difficult instances with universities in the last sort of year or so. There have been some perhaps less than ideal responses. But I think a lot of that really comes from that central question of what is this space for? And I think moving forward, if organizations really sort of examine that and examine that principle of, what do they stand for? What is this an environment for learning, or is this what people do before they start their career? And I think for more that institutions can sort of gain that understanding, it will kind of help their responses. Obviously, here's me telling universities how to run their business. It's not so much that, but just being as somebody who is, I'm kind of within the system, but I'm sort of on the outside as well because I'm like a part-time member of staff. I'm not there all the time. I'm only in like a couple of days a week. And so I kind of have a bit of objectivity about how students see the space and how the space is viewed by outside entities.
I would love to delve deeper into that. But I am over here thinking, wow, Greg's work. We need to maybe talk about what Greg is working on right now.
Good
right?
point.
Just all of this valuable insight regarding how we get to where we are when creating work and why, right? I don't know about you, Danny, but I would love to hear from Greg. One work in particular, If Mina Laugh, Me Cry, I think is what it is, right? And I feel like we want you to share something about that particular work so that people who are listening and watching, just have a sort of, I don't know, just a taste of what you're doing right now, then they can investigate further on your website.
Yeah. So If Mina Laugh, Me Cry was a project that was run by, it was a collaboration between a few entities. Shout out to Grace Cress from Shelby Studios and Real Rebels Radio. And that was a an arts activism campaign that was centered around police brutality and typically unarmed black men that have died in police custody over the past sort of 20, 30 years or so. And it's really around the work of the HCDA, which was the Hackney Community Defense Association, which is a community-run organization that campaigned on behalf of the families of the bereaved in terms of seeking justice, in terms of holding the police accountable. I was brought on to develop work as, really in the vein of an artist. More than anything, there were several artists that were involved, and this work was going to basically become the sort of the bulk of the festival. Festival happened last summer, so this summer just gone. And I think it gives a good sort of snapshot into some of the work I do, because even though, so the project actually kicked off like September, October of 2023. So it had a really long development time. But that long development time was really discussions and conversations. It was more discussions and conversations than anything else. And I got to speak with, well, several, but in particular, there was one conversation with a lady. I don't know if she'd want me to name her on this, but she's one of the affected families who had experienced this firsthand. And, it's one of the most traumatic stories I've ever heard in my life. And there was one point at a meeting where we were just sat on one table, and she just kind of recounted the whole thing, the whole night. And it was something that happened like 20 something years ago. But when she was recounting it, it was like it happened yesterday, and there was real, like, powerful emotion. And it was so visceral. It was right there. And all I could do was just listen. Like, there's no role of me like, hey, how about we, draw this or write them. Like, my role in that space was just to hear it, just to hear that testimony. And that's what a lot of this work in this space is like. It's just these discussions and these conversations. And the work that I produced was really around speech, was really around idioms that I've heard, and my own relationship with the police. Something that I've had a bit of experience, certainly when I was a much younger man. So where I grew up in Hackney, I guess comparable for those of you in the States, I guess the most comparable borough maybe Brooklyn, kind of a similar vibe, similar sort of demographic makeup. And, it was something that as a kid, the presence of police was like this just real concern. It was like a genuine concern where, people will tell you how to be, how to walk, don't wear your baseball cap, take your cap off if they come by. If you're in a car, do this, don't do that, make sure. And, there's this real sense of danger and trepidation to the point where, I experienced some of that firsthand, not to that level, but it was enough for me to really form my work around these conversations and these discussions. And so, yeah, it's just an example really of how much that conversation, discussion, and insight forms the work. And it isn't just about sort of me being on the computer and, playing around with typefaces. There are real people behind it. Again, art is about the artist, and design is about the user.
So, oh gosh, I just saw the 5-minute warning from Janet. Ah! Oh
That's why I
no.
wrapped it up and I asked
Oh
it.
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to ask if you're an artivist. Do you define yourself as an artivist?
I do not. I
Do
do not.
not.
No. So my work sometimes will sort of sway into the area of activism.
Yeah.
Not that much. Those projects tend to be sort of few and far between. I see my work as really about influence and persuasion. So for
Mhm.
me, it falls far more into the remit of advocacy.
Right, which I think you did such a good job of of delineating these two terms earlier on, but it's yeah, I just I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much more we can talk about because in my mind, influence and persuasion can still be elements of activism, but I know
100%.
that like
100%.
yeah, and like you said, there's so much crossover too. But um I guess with when asking about do you define yourself as an artivist, like I was thinking really actually about the artist part,
Mhm.
because you were talking about graphic design for users and but you do define yourself as an artist, yes? Like would you say an artist before a graphic designer or is it equal?
Not really, because the work that I do, so to use an example, like my sort of billboard work, um, even though it's contextualized as the work of an artist, and it's referred to as the work of an artist, and it has been profiled and written about as the work of an artist, I'm really thinking about users. I'm really thinking about people. How does this help? What conversations does this start? What conversations might it produce? Is there a better way of doing it?
Hmm.
And as a very quick example, one of the billboards went up in a particular area, and it was a billboard that was around uh, Britain and its relationship with Black history, slavery, and colonialism. And I started getting all of this feedback from Irish people. Like tons and tons and tons of people were just like, "Hey, you should have done this. You should have." And I was like, "Why am I getting so many? What is this about?" And then somebody told me, "Well, that billboard actually went up in a predominantly Irish area." And I was like, "Oh my God, I didn't know that." And it's like, "Oh no, historically, yeah, 100%." I'm talking about Kilburn for anybody watching in the UK. And I was like, "Huh." So I then went away and I was like, "I wonder if there's a way to build on that. Like, is there something that we could have done for the community where the community can co-create in that space and put up something that relates to their story?" So I'm always thinking in terms of what do people get from this? How can it be improved? Whereas I
Hmm.
feel, or at least how I contextualize being an artist, I may never explain my artistic work. I might just put it up and just let people divine their own interpretations. I might not,
Hmm.
I might sort of refuse to explain it, and that would be my right as the artist, right? But
Hmm.
because my work is so much around how people engage with it, I'm always talking about it. I'm always writing about it. I'm always answering comments about it and questions, because that's the point. The point is those conversations. There's sometimes I have to be like, okay, I'm not, I get trolled a lot, and I'm like, yeah, not today. Um, but in general, the work is always about how people respond to it, right? So by setting my stall out, that means I kind of have to engage with the work. I have to discuss it. I have to talk about it. And
Hmm.
that's why it feels different for me than being an artist. I have produced work as an artist and been in art shows, and you just have a piece up and it is what it is. But this is different. This is like dialogue or conversation, or at least that's the intention. Even when it doesn't work, I'm like, well, why didn't it work? Was it because of the message? Was it because of how the thing was framed? And when I produce things, so when I produce like typefaces, which are based on elements of Black British history, on protest movements or community groups, and they're inspired by these things, so that when people use the typeface, they have to engage with these histories. And then when I see the feedback to how people are using those typefaces and how they're recontextualizing it, because you can't use the typeface unless you engage with the history. You can try, I mean, as you probably can, but it'll be weird if you were like super racist and downloaded one of my typefaces to make your poster. I'd be like, okay, I guess. So it's always about how do people engage with it, and how do I collect those responses, and how do I measure them, and what can be done with them. So that's why I tend to kind of typify my work more in the realm of design. But you're right, there's tons of crossover.
Yeah.
Man, Greg. Yes, we can continue this conversation because as you were sharing the definition of artists and what art does, I'm like, man, that's what artivism does, what you are saying graphic design does. you know, the conversation that comes out of the work that you create and the
Mhm.
follow up and the follow through. It's
Yeah.
important to understand the measurability, right? And how it's going to impact the campaign, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is a conversation that we can continue because that's deep. Just thinking about the definitions. We talked about the
Yeah.
definitions and how we define university. How do
Mhm.
we define artist and art?
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
so I think it's time for another question.
Okay.
A fun question.
Mhm.
And what I'm going to do is share my screen, and then you'll know
Should I do
what
the
that.
sound effect?
Yes.
Doobly-doop, 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 doobly-doop.
So, in your
Oh, okay.
utopia, there would be.
Hmm.
Oh wow, just like that, just super
Yeah.
open-ended.
This is our closeout question we love
Just
to
like
ask all
that.
of our guests.
In your utopia, there would be, oh my God. So this is just blue sky, absolutely anything. Wow.
Yes.
Um, okay, so in my utopia, and like this is something that I've been thinking about recently. In my utopia, we would figure out a way to utilize creatives in a way that frees them from the grind of commerce. So a lot of creatives, a lot of the younger creatives that I mentor and I tutor are trying to find spaces where they can produce impactful, important, meaningful work in a way that is useful and rewarding, and yet still make a living. And in
Mhm.
my utopia, there would be, it's almost like rather than having sort of design companies and organizations, it's almost like we have creative think tanks. So we have kind of collective spaces where young creatives can come in and solve important problems. And these aren't problems that are restricted to the areas of design or product design or interaction design or UX design. These will be big problems. So we're kind of utilizing all that talent and all of that insight. And, you know, it could be anything. It could be um, looking at how people vote, or how do we engage more young people with the democratic process. It might be thinking about how to solve things like resource management or food waste. And so in my utopia, there would be collective spaces where young creators could come together and solve important problems.
Ooh,
Yes.
yes.
Sorry, that was probably way too deep than what you're asking,
No,
judging by the
that's what we're
unicorn.
looking for. And I feel like I might say that that probably is the best answer for me so far of all the answers we've gotten. Because I'm like, yes, that's the world I want to live in.
You know, like I just feel like there's, and you
Thrive.
know,
Yeah.
there are organizations that do that function in that way.
Mhm, mhm,
In the UK, we have an organization called the Design Council, which are the government's advisor on design. And then there's organizations like IDEO and a few others. But I feel like that kind of idea of kind of untethering the creativity from this thing of like, you know, you're here to make menus and design flyers. And rather than doing that, we can let's utilize all of that energy and all of that brilliance to solve really important problems.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so
yeah.
much. Thank you so much for all of this wonderful insight that I know folks are going to be able to use and share with others. Again, these conversations, right? We can have part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to talk further about these.
Absolutely. And you know,
Right?
and just the final point I'd add is the reason
Yeah.
that things like this are so important is that when I talk about the transformation work in terms of the design process, that bit is usually invisible. So when I produce case
Mm.
studies on my work, you don't see the hours of conversations, you don't hear the telephone calls, you don't see that everybody sitting in a meeting room and discussing all of those elements. So it's really important as creatives that we document our work and we archive it wherever we can, because we need to show that process. And how we show that process is by platforms like this, by discussion, by testimonial, by sharing like our experiences. That's how we document this. And the document part is really, that's the part that really matters.
Yes. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for closing us out on that. I think that's something that absolutely students need to know so they can do it from the beginning of their careers. And folks who have been doing this need to be reminded of so that we can continue to do it, right?
Absolutely.
Talk about that. What is it called? The impact. People always asking about the social impact. This right here, right, shows that. So again, thank you, Greg. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to announce that in part 3 of this wonderful design advocacy collection, we'll reflect on the topic with a few guests in our first ever RFC study group. So Greg, all the things you're saying, we're going to be studying you.
Unpacking. We have a lot to unpack. Yeah.
Right. And that's going to happen on Saturday, December 14th at 1 p.m. ET live on our channel. So remember to subscribe, like, and share. And we also want to, take this moment to say, please, our listeners, that this podcast is funded by the two of us and your donations. Please help us keep our podcast going by making a donation through our PayPal link in the show notes. All right. So once again, we want to thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. And we will see you all next time.
Next month.
All right.
And on the social medias.
On the social medias. All right. Peace, people.